On a quiet Tuesday evening, the streets of suburban Maryland were calm and peaceful. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and empty sidewalks. Officer Greg Peterson sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos while keeping an eye on the road ahead. It was one of those slow nights where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just another routine shift in a sleepy town. As Greg drove down Maple Avenue, his attention was caught by a sleek black sedan gliding smoothly along the street. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about the car, but something made him glance at his speedometer. The sedan was moving slightly faster than the posted limit, just enough to warrant a second look. Greg hesitated for a moment, debating whether it was worth pulling over someone for such a minor infraction. But rules were rules, and he decided to follow protocol. Flipping on his flashing lights, Greg signaled the driver to pull over. The sedan slowed down obediently and came to a stop near the curb. Greg grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the patrol car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the vehicle. He tapped lightly on the driver's side window with his flashlight, waiting for the driver to roll it down. When the window lowered, Greg found himself face to face with a man who looked completely at ease despite being pulled over. The driver wore a sharp navy blue suit that screamed professionalism, paired with a crisp white shirt and a tie perfectly knotted at his throat. His posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed for someone sitting on the side of the road under police scrutiny. "Good evening, officer," the man said politely, his voice smooth and confident. "Is there a problem?" Greg frowned slightly. Most people he pulled over were either nervous or irritated, but this guy seemed different. Something about his demeanor felt off, like he wasn't intimidated in the slightest. Still, Greg stuck to his usual script. "Evening, sir. I clocked you going 5 miles over the speed limit. Do you know how fast you were going?" The man nodded calmly. "I might have been a little above the limit, officer. My apologies. I'm in a bit of a hurry." Greg raised an eyebrow. "License and registration, please." Without hesitation, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal what appeared to be some kind of badge. Greg leaned closer, squinting at it under the dim light of his flashlight. The badge gleamed faintly, bearing the insignia of the Central Intelligence Agency. Beneath it, the words "Special Agent Marcus Johnson" were engraved in bold letters. Greg straightened up, taken aback. Was this guy serious? A CIA agent, in this quiet little town? For a moment, Greg wondered if he should take the badge seriously, or if it was just a clever trick. After all, fake badges weren't unheard of. Greg cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative. "All right, Mr. Johnson, if that's your real name, step out of the vehicle. Let's have a chat." Marcus complied without argument, stepping out of the car with the same calm composure he'd shown since the beginning. As Greg studied him more closely, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would a federal agent be driving around here? And why did he seem so unfazed by getting pulled over? Doubt swirled in Greg's mind, and his instincts told him not to let this slide. Not yet. Little did he know, those doubts would lead to a situation far bigger than he could imagine. Greg's skepticism only deepened as he sized up Marcus. The man stood tall and composed, his hands resting casually at his sides, exuding an air of quiet authority that Greg found both unsettling and irritating. Most people would be visibly anxious or defensive during a traffic stop, especially when accused of carrying a fake badge. But Marcus didn't flinch. He simply waited, his expression calm, almost as if he were humoring Greg rather than taking him seriously. "Listen," Greg began, his tone firm but tinged with frustration. "I've seen plenty of fake IDs in my time. You're going to have to do better than this." He gestured toward the badge still clutched in Marcus's hand. "If you're really CIA, then explain what you're doing speeding through a residential neighborhood. That doesn't exactly scream top secret mission." Marcus sighed softly, as though he'd expected this reaction. "Officer Peterson," he said, his voice steady and measured, "I appreciate your diligence, but I'm on official business. Unfortunately, I can't provide details about my assignment. It's classified. If you need confirmation, feel free to call the number on the back of my badge. They'll verify my identity." Greg hesitated for a split second. There was something about Marcus's tone, confident yet respectful, that made him pause. But pride quickly pushed aside any flicker of doubt. Call it instinct, ego, or just plain stubbornness. But Greg wasn't about to let some smooth-talking stranger walk away without proving himself. Besides, how likely was it that a real CIA agent would end up in his jurisdiction? "You expect me to believe you're running around here on some secret government operation?" Greg shot back, his voice rising slightly. "In a town where the biggest crime last week was someone stealing newspapers off porches. Come on, give me a break." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Greg with an unreadable expression. "Officer, I understand your position, but trust me when I say this. You don't want to interfere with what I'm doing right now. It's bigger than both of us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Greg bristled at the subtle challenge in Marcus's tone. Who did this guy think he was? Some untouchable spy immune to the law? Greg tightened his grip on his flashlight, irritation bubbling over into anger. This wasn't just about verifying credentials anymore. It was personal now. "That's it," Greg snapped, stepping closer. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You can explain yourself down at the station." For the first time, Marcus's calm demeanor faltered. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, and his dark eyes locked onto Greg's with an intensity that sent a shiver down the officer's spine. "You're making a mistake," Marcus warned, his voice low but sharp. "A big one." But Greg wasn't listening. All he could focus on was the fact that this man, a complete stranger, was refusing to comply with basic police procedure. In Greg's mind, there was no room for exceptions, no matter how convincing Marcus sounded. Rules were rules, and everyone had to follow them, even supposed CIA agents. Without waiting for further resistance, Greg grabbed Marcus's arm and spun him around forcefully. Marcus didn't resist, but the tension in his body was palpable as Greg slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. As the metal clicked shut, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter but laced with warning. "All right, Officer Peterson. You've made your choice. Just remember, you had your chance." Greg ignored him, too caught up in his own sense of righteousness to pay attention. He patted Marcus down quickly, finding nothing out of the ordinary except for the badge and a sleek smartphone in his pocket. Everything seemed normal enough. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was missing something important. Still, Greg pushed the thought aside. Whatever Marcus claimed to be, whatever story he was spinning, it didn't matter. What mattered was enforcing the law. And right now, Greg believed he was doing exactly that. Little did he know, his decision to arrest Marcus was about to set off a chain of events that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his job, his judgment, and himself. With Marcus now handcuffed and sitting in the back seat of the patrol car, Greg climbed into the driver's seat, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't adding up. The man's badge looked real enough, at least more convincing than any fake ID Greg had ever seen. And Marcus's calm demeanor wasn't what Greg expected from someone trying to pull a fast one. Still, he told himself, appearances could be deceiving. Maybe Marcus was just a smooth talker with a knack for staying cool under pressure. As Greg turned on the radio to report the arrest, Marcus leaned forward slightly from the backseat. "Officer," he said evenly, "you're making a serious error here. I understand your position, but you need to let me make one phone call. That's all it'll take to clear this up." Greg glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, and who exactly are you planning to call?" "Your handler." He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Look, buddy, I've heard every excuse in the book. Save it for the station." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he said quietly, "Fine. But when things escalate, and they will, you'll wish you'd listened." The comment sent a chill down Greg's spine, though he tried not to show it. Who did this guy think he was, issuing warnings like some kind of movie villain? Determined not to let Marcus rattle him, Greg picked up the radio mic and began relaying the details of the arrest to dispatch. Just as he finished speaking, Marcus spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "Officer, if you don't allow me to make that call right now, you're going to regret it. Trust me." For reasons he couldn't fully explain, Greg hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore Marcus completely, to stick to protocol and haul him straight to the station. But another part, the part that had started whispering doubts since the moment he cuffed him, wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was truth to his claims. Against his better judgment, Greg sighed and reached for the keys in the ignition. "All right, fine. One call. But I'm watching you." He got out of the car and opened the back door, pulling Marcus out carefully, keeping a firm grip on his arm. Greg unlocked the cuffs just enough to free one hand so Marcus could use his phone. Marcus wasted no time dialing a number from memory. As the line connected, Greg watched closely, expecting some rehearsed act or cryptic message designed to throw him off balance. Instead, Marcus spoke in clipped, professional tones, using words and phrases that sounded anything but ordinary. "This is Agent Johnson. We have a situation. Yes, local PD intervened during Operation Nightfall. No, I'm secure for now. But we need immediate backup. Suspect is still active." There was a pause as Marcus listened intently to the person on the other end. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he added, "Send a team. Officer Peterson isn't cooperating." Greg's stomach sank as he processed the conversation. Operation Nightfall. Backup. None of this sounded like the ramblings of a con artist. Before he could say anything, Marcus ended the call and handed the phone back to Greg. "Help is on the way," Marcus said simply, meeting Greg's gaze with an unshakable confidence. Before Greg could respond, the distant roar of engines broke the silence. Both men turned toward the sound as three unmarked black SUVs came speeding down the street, their tires screeching as they pulled up behind Greg's patrol car. Doors flew open almost simultaneously, and a group of sharply dressed individuals stepped out, their movements precise and coordinated. Each wore dark suits and carried themselves with an air of authority that left no room for doubt. They weren't ordinary civilians. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, approached Greg and Marcus with purposeful strides. She flashed a badge before speaking, her voice commanding and devoid of warmth. "I'm Director Evelyn Carter of the CIA. What's going on here?" Greg felt his throat go dry. His eyes darted between Marcus, who stood silently beside him, and the intimidating figure now demanding answers. For the first time that night, Greg realized he might have made a grave mistake, one that could cost him far more than his pride. The arrival of the unmarked SUVs transformed the quiet suburban street into something resembling a scene from an action movie. The red and blue lights of Greg's patrol car reflected off the polished hoods of the vehicles as agents in dark suits poured out, their movements swift and deliberate. Every step they took radiated authority, and it was clear these weren't ordinary people. They were professionals, trained to handle situations far beyond anything Greg encountered on his nightly patrols. Director Evelyn Carter wasted no time. She strode toward Greg and Marcus with an intensity that demanded attention. Her sharp features were framed by sleek, shoulder-length hair, and her piercing gaze seemed to see straight through Greg. Without hesitation, she addressed him, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Officer, I'm Director Carter of the CIA. What is the meaning of this?" She gestured sharply at Marcus's cuffed hands. Greg swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like a small fish in very deep water. His earlier confidence wavered under Carter's scrutiny. For a moment, he struggled to find the right words. "Ma'am," he began, his voice less steady than before, "I pulled this man over for speeding. He claimed to be CIA, but I had no way of verifying." Carter cut him off with a wave of her hand, her expression hardening further. "You didn't verify because you assumed he was lying," she said bluntly, her tone dripping with disapproval. "That's not how we operate, officer, not when national security is at stake." Before Greg could respond, Marcus stepped forward, speaking calmly but firmly. "Director, I tried to explain my situation. Officer Peterson wasn't willing to listen." There was no accusation in his voice, just a matter-of-fact delivery that somehow made Greg feel even worse. Carter turned her focus back to Greg, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Agent Johnson here is part of a critical operation, one that involves tracking down a dangerous individual who poses a significant threat to public safety. Your interference has put both his mission and innocent lives at risk." Greg felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at Marcus, who stood silently beside Carter, his expression unreadable. In that moment, Greg realized just how wrong he had been. This wasn't some routine traffic stop. This was something far bigger than him, and he had blundered right into the middle of it. "Release him immediately," Carter ordered, her voice brooking no dissent. Greg fumbled with the keys to the handcuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked them. As the metal fell away, Marcus rubbed his wrists but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes, and Greg couldn't meet his eyes. Carter turned to Marcus next, her demeanor softening ever so slightly. "Agent Johnson, are you all right? Did he compromise your cover?" Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am. My cover remains intact, but time is critical. We need to move quickly if we're going to intercept the target." Carter nodded briskly, then turned back to Greg. "Officer Peterson, consider yourself fortunate that Agent Johnson's mission hasn't been irreparably damaged. However, rest assured, there will be consequences for your actions tonight. You'll hear from us soon enough." With that, she signaled to her team, and they began dispersing back to their vehicles. Marcus paused for a moment, glancing at Greg with an inscrutable look. Then, without another word, he followed Carter to one of the SUVs. The engines roared to life, and within moments, the convoy sped away, leaving Greg standing alone in the dim glow of his patrol car's flashing lights. As the sound of the engines faded into the distance, Greg sank onto the hood of his car, his mind reeling. He had always prided himself on following the rules, on doing his job diligently. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he felt a crushing mix of shame and disbelief. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call, one that would force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the assumptions he had made. And as he sat there, staring at the empty road, he knew his life and his career would never be the same again. The ride back to the precinct was a blur for Greg. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the encounter with Marcus and Director Carter. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. He couldn't shake the image of Carter's piercing gaze or the quiet confidence in Marcus's voice when he warned Greg about regretting his decision. For the first time in his career, Greg felt truly out of his depth. When he arrived at the station, the usual hum of activity did little to distract him. Officers chatted casually, radios crackled with routine updates, and paperwork shuffled across desks, but none of it mattered to Greg. He walked straight to his captain's office, knocking firmly on the door before stepping inside. Captain Reynolds looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing at the sight of Greg's unusually somber expression. "What's going on, Peterson?" Reynolds asked, leaning back in his chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Greg hesitated, unsure where to begin. How could he explain something that still didn't fully make sense to him? Taking a deep breath, he recounted the events of the night. The traffic stop, Marcus's claims of being CIA, the phone call, and finally, the arrival of Director Carter and her team. As he spoke, Reynolds' expression shifted from curiosity to concern, then to outright disbelief. "You're telling me," Reynolds said slowly, "that you arrested a CIA agent on a traffic stop?" Greg winced at the incredulity in his captain's voice. "Sir, I thought he was lying. His badge looked real, but how was I supposed to know? People fake credentials all the time." Reynolds sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Peterson, you don't just assume someone is lying when they claim to be federal law enforcement. There are protocols for verifying these things, protocols you clearly ignored." He leaned forward, his tone sharp but controlled. "Do you have any idea what this means? The CIA doesn't take kindly to interference, especially when it jeopardizes an operation. You've put this department in a very difficult position." Greg sank into the chair across from Reynolds, his face pale. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir. I was just doing my job, or so I thought." "Well, your job has consequences," Reynolds shot back. "Director Carter called me while you were en route. She wasn't happy, to say the least. Internal Affairs will be launching an investigation into this incident, and trust me, they won't go easy on you." The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. An investigation. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a potential career-ending blunder. But the worst part wasn't the professional fallout. It was the realization of how reckless he'd been. By refusing to verify Marcus's credentials, by letting pride and suspicion cloud his judgment, he had risked far more than his own reputation. He had endangered lives. As if reading his thoughts, Reynolds softened slightly. "Greg, I get it. You're a good officer, and you care about keeping this town safe. But this goes beyond our jurisdiction. When someone says they're CIA, or FBI, or Homeland Security, you listen. You double-check. You don't assume they're lying because they don't fit your idea of who they should be." Greg nodded numbly, the truth of those words sinking in. He had let bias guide his actions, jumping to conclusions without evidence. It wasn't just about Marcus's badge or suit. It was about the assumptions Greg had made based on appearances. And now, those assumptions had blown up in his face. Before dismissing him, Reynolds handed Greg a folder. "Read through this. It's a briefing on interagency cooperation and protocol. Familiarize yourself with it. And consider this a wake-up call. We can't afford mistakes like this. Not here. Not anywhere." As Greg left the office, the folder clutched tightly in his hands. He felt the full weight of his actions settle over him. The bustling energy of the precinct seemed distant now, almost surreal. All around him, officers continued their work as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed for Greg. He realized that this wasn't just about following rules. It was about humility, accountability, and understanding the bigger picture. And as he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the folder, one thing became painfully clear. He had a lot to learn. Not just about policing, but about himself. Days turned into weeks, and Greg found himself navigating a storm of consequences that rippled through every aspect of his life. At the precinct, whispers followed him wherever he went. Officers who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or spoke to him only when necessary. The camaraderie he had taken for granted was replaced by an uncomfortable silence, as though his colleagues were unsure how to act around someone who had made such a colossal mistake. Even Captain Reynolds seemed distant, his usual stern but fair demeanor giving way to a cold professionalism that stung more than any reprimand. But it wasn't just the isolation that weighed on Greg, it was the guilt. Every time he replayed the events of that night in his mind, he cringed at his own arrogance. He thought about Marcus's calm mornings, Director Carter's icy glare, and the way the entire situation spiraled out of control because of his refusal to pause and verify the truth. The worst part was knowing that his actions could have endangered lives. What if Marcus's mission had failed because of him? What if innocent people had been hurt, or worse? Determined to make amends, Greg decided to reach out to Marcus. It wasn't easy. After the incident, Marcus had vanished from Greg's world as quickly as he'd entered it. But Greg persisted, eventually contacting the CIA liaison assigned to their region. To his surprise, Marcus agreed to meet him, not at a federal building or some secretive location, but at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The day of the meeting, Greg arrived early, his stomach churning with nerves. He chose a table near the window, where sunlight streamed in and softened the sterile atmosphere of the small cafe. When Marcus walked in, Greg immediately stood up, feeling awkward and out of place. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, Marcus looked nothing like the sharp-suited operative Greg remembered from that fateful night. For a moment, Greg wondered if this was even the same person. "Agent Johnson," Greg began, extending a hand hesitantly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Marcus shook his hand firmly, his expression neutral. "Officer Peterson, I hope we can keep this brief." Greg nodded, gesturing for Marcus to sit. As they settled into their seats, Greg struggled to find the right words. "Look, I wanted to apologize. I handled things poorly that night. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I put your mission, and possibly lives, at risk. That's not who I want to be as an officer." Marcus studied him for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I appreciate the apology, officer. Not everyone would take responsibility the way you're trying to. But let me ask you something. Why didn't you check my credentials? Why did you assume I was lying?" The question hit Greg like a punch to the chest. He hesitated, searching for an honest answer. "I guess I thought you were too calm, too confident. You didn't seem like someone who should be pulled over for speeding. And when you said you were CIA, it felt unbelievable. Like it didn't fit." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm black." The bluntness of the question caught Greg off guard. His cheeks flushed, and he looked down at the table, ashamed. "Maybe," he admitted quietly. "I don't know. Maybe subconsciously. I doubted you because of bias. I hate to admit it, but yeah, maybe that played a role." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "It happens more often than you'd think. People see me and assume I'm not who I say I am. They question my authority, my credentials, my purpose. Sometimes it's harmless ignorance. Other times, it costs us dearly." Greg swallowed hard, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I never meant to let bias dictate my actions. I swear, I'll do better. I've already started reading up on interagency protocols and implicit bias training. I want to learn. I need to learn." Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to consider Greg's sincerity. "Good. Accountability is the first step toward change. Just remember, Officer Peterson, moments like these define who you are. How you move forward matters more than anything else." As the conversation wound down, Greg left the cafe feeling a mix of relief and determination. Marcus hadn't offered forgiveness outright, but he had listened, and that was enough for now. For the first time since the arrest, Greg felt a glimmer of hope. If he could turn this mistake into a lesson, if he could grow from it, then maybe he could rebuild not just his career, but his character. And deep down, he knew that was the hardest, yet most important, work of all. In the weeks that followed his meeting with Marcus, Greg threw himself into making meaningful changes, not just for himself, but for the department as a whole. The incident had been a wake-up call, and Greg was determined to ensure that no one else made the same mistakes he had. He began by diving deep into the materials Captain Reynolds had given him, studying everything from interagency protocols to case studies on bias in law enforcement. But he didn't stop there. Greg sought out additional resources, attending workshops and seminars on implicit bias, cultural competency, and effective communication. What surprised Greg most was how much he didn't know. For years, he'd prided himself on being a fair and diligent officer, someone who treated everyone equally under the law. But as he listened to experts and read stories of people who had faced discrimination or misunderstanding at the hands of police, he realized how blind he'd been to his own biases. It wasn't enough to simply want to be fair. It required constant self-awareness and effort. Armed with this newfound understanding, Greg became an advocate for change within the precinct. At first, his colleagues were skeptical. Some dismissed his efforts as overcompensation, while others accused him of trying to make up for his mistake by pushing unnecessary reforms. But Greg persisted, sharing what he'd learned in team meetings and informal conversations. Slowly but surely, his dedication began to resonate with some of his peers. A few officers even approached him privately, admitting they'd never considered how their actions might unintentionally alienate members of the community. One of Greg's biggest initiatives was organizing a training session specifically focused on interagency cooperation and recognizing federal credentials. With Captain Reynolds' approval, Greg invited a guest speaker from the Department of Homeland Security to lead the workshop. The presentation covered everything from identifying legitimate badges to understanding the scope of different agencies' operations. By the end of the session, many officers admitted they felt more prepared and less likely to repeat Greg's error. Beyond the precinct, Greg also worked to rebuild trust with the community. He volunteered for outreach programs, participating in neighborhood meetings and youth mentorship events. During these interactions, he openly acknowledged his past mistakes, using them as teaching moments rather than hiding behind pride. His honesty struck a chord with residents, many of whom appreciated his willingness to admit fault and grow from it. Over time, the icy distance between Greg and the community began to thaw. Despite these strides, Greg knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that he'd never fully redeem himself. But each time he felt overwhelmed, he reminded himself of Marcus's parting words. "How you move forward matters more than anything else." Those words became a mantra, guiding Greg through the challenges of reinventing himself as an officer and as a person. By the time several months had passed, Greg noticed subtle shifts in both his personal life and professional environment. Fellow officers started seeking his input on difficult calls, trusting his judgment in situations where tensions ran high. Community members greeted him warmly again, their smiles genuine instead of forced. Even Captain Reynolds seemed pleased with Greg's progress, commending him during a staff meeting for turning a negative experience into a catalyst for positive change. Though the memory of that fateful night still lingered in the back of Greg's mind, it no longer haunted him. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far he'd come and how much further he could go if he stayed committed to growth. Little did he know, however, that his journey toward redemption would soon intersect with Marcus once again, bringing new opportunities to prove just how much he had changed. Months after their meeting at the cafe, Greg had almost convinced himself that he'd never see Marcus again. The CIA agent had vanished from his life as quickly as he'd entered it, leaving behind only the lessons Greg had learned from their brief encounter. But fate has a way of circling back when you least expect it. It happened during a joint operation between local law enforcement and federal agencies. A suspected human trafficking ring was operating in the outskirts of Maryland, and the case required collaboration across multiple departments. Greg was assigned to assist with perimeter security, a role that kept him on the fringes of the action but still deeply involved in the mission. As he coordinated with other officers near one of the staging areas, a familiar voice cut through the hum of activity. "Officer Peterson," Marcus said, approaching Greg with a clipboard in hand. He wore his usual sharp suit, but this time, there was no tension between them, only professionalism. "Looks like we're working together again." Greg blinked in surprise, momentarily caught off guard. "Agent Johnson," he replied, offering a respectful nod. "Small world, huh?" Marcus gave a faint smile. "Smaller than you'd think. I heard about your efforts at the precinct. Bias training, community outreach. Good work." The compliment caught Greg off guard, and he felt a flicker of pride mixed with humility. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I've been trying to do better, for everyone's sake." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I can see that. You've come a long way since that night." The comment hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Greg hesitated before responding, choosing his words carefully. "That night, it changed me, Agent Johnson. I won't say I'm perfect now, but I'm working on it. Every day." Marcus's expression softened slightly, and he extended a hand. "Call me Marcus, and for what it's worth, I believe you." Shaking Marcus's hand, Greg felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that he was making progress. For someone like Marcus, who carried the weight of responsibility every day, those few words meant more than Greg could put into words. As the operation unfolded, Greg found himself partnering with Marcus on several occasions. Their interactions were professional but tinged with mutual respect. Marcus shared insights about federal operations, explaining how local PD could better align with federal agents during high-stakes missions. In turn, Greg offered practical knowledge about the community's dynamics, helping Marcus navigate potential challenges. Together, they formed an unlikely but effective team. By the end of the operation, the trafficking ring had been dismantled, and dozens of victims were safely recovered. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light over the scene, Greg stood alongside Marcus, watching as paramedics tended to the rescued individuals. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply absorbed the gravity of what had been accomplished. "You did good out there," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. "Not just today, but over the past few months. People notice, Greg. They respect you for owning up to your mistakes and doing the hard work to fix them." Greg looked down at his boots, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without reminders, like the one you gave me that night. So, thank you." Marcus chuckled softly. "Just doing my job. But if you ever need advice or another reality check, you know where to find me." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of agents and officers packing up equipment. Greg watched him go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed, and he was okay with that. In the months that followed, Greg continued his advocacy work, becoming a vocal proponent for reform within the department. His reputation slowly rebuilt itself, not because he erased his past mistakes, but because he used them as stepping stones toward growth. And while Marcus remained a distant figure in Greg's life, their occasional encounters served as reminders of how far both men had come, and how much farther they could go when accountability met humility. For Greg, the journey wasn't about erasing regret. It was about transforming it into something meaningful. And as he stood there, watching the sunrise paint the sky with streaks of orange and pink, he realized something profound. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a path, one he was proud to walk.